Geltwyn Ashford had learned to inhabit silence, the way other women inhabited their ball gowns. She wore it every evening, adjusted it across her shoulders like an invisible cloak, and let it shield her from the glances that slid over her without truly seeing. The grand ballroom of Whitmore Manor gleamed under the light of 1,000 candles on that Christmas Eve, each flame reflected in the mirrors adorning the walls, multiplying the splendor until it seemed heaven itself had descended to dance among mortals. But Elowyn remained seated in her crimson velvet chair, hands resting delicately in her lap, watching the couples swirl across the dance floor with the same serene expression she had cultivated over 16 consecutive winters. She knew every face in that ballroom. She knew Lady Pemberton, whose shrill laugh cut through the air whenever some gentleman made a mediocre jest. She knew Lord Ashby, who drank too much and spoke too loudly about his estates in the north. She knew the young debutantes who arrived each season with eyes bright with hope, only to realize as the night wore on that invisible hierarchies governed this gilded world. And she knew with a certainty that had long since ceased to wound her, that not one of them would cross the polished marble floor to ask her to dance. The scandal had happened so long ago that most of the younger attendees probably didn't even know the details anymore. They simply understood that Elowyn Ashford was not someone one approached. She was not someone whose company one sought. She existed in a peculiar liminal space, present enough to fulfill social obligation by attending, invisible enough to be comfortably ignored. Her family's name still commanded respect, enough to secure her an invitation to every significant gathering, but the shadow that clung to her reputation ensured she experienced these events from the periphery, always watching, never participating. The musicians struck up a waltz, and Elowyn felt the familiar tightening in her chest that accompanied this particular piece. It had been her mother's favorite. Caroline Ashford had loved Christmas with a passion that bordered on devotion, had insisted that the Christmas ball at Whitmore Manor was the pinnacle of the social season, the one night when magic seemed possible even for those who had long since stopped believing in such things. How bitterly ironic that this ball, which her mother had so cherished, had become the stage for Elowyn's yearly ritual of elegant isolation. She reached for her glass of champagne, more for something to do with her hands than from any real thirst, and took a small sip. The bubbles fizzed against her tongue, and she let her gaze drift toward the tall windows that lined the eastern wall. Snow had begun to fall, fat flakes tumbling through the darkness beyond the glass, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine simply standing up, walking through those doors, and disappearing into that soft, white silence. No one would notice her absence. No one would remark upon it until perhaps the evening had ended, and someone happened to observe that Miss Ashford had departed early, as she sometimes did when the loneliness became too acute to bear gracefully. But she wouldn't leave. She never did. Because leaving felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that they had won, whoever they were, the collective mass of society that had judged her guilty for sins she hadn't committed. So she remained, season after season, a ghost at the feast, a shadow in the candlelight, bearing witness to joy she was not permitted to share. The waltz ended, and another began. Couples reformed, changing partners with practiced ease, and the swirl of silk and satin created its own kind of music, a whisper of fabric and ambition. Elowyn adjusted the emerald bracelet on her wrist, a family heirloom her grandmother had pressed into her hands before she died, whispering that some treasures outlast scandal, that some beauty endures even when the world turns its back. She wore it to every Christmas ball, a small act of defiance, a quiet insistence that she too had worth, even if no one else seemed willing to acknowledge it. She was so lost in her thoughts that she almost didn't notice when the music faltered. It was subtle at first, just a slight hesitation in the strings, but then the entire orchestra seemed to draw a collective breath and hold it. The dancers slowed, turned, and a ripple of whispers moved through the ballroom like wind through wheat. Elowyn looked up, curiosity momentarily displacing the numbness she typically cultivated at these events. The great doors at the northern end of the ballroom had opened, and a figure stood silhouetted against the swirling snow beyond. The footman who had admitted him looked slightly stunned, as if he hadn't quite believed his own eyes when he'd answered the door. The figure stepped forward into the light, and Elowyn felt something shift in her chest, a sensation she couldn't quite name, as if the earth had tilted slightly on its axis, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. He was tall, with dark hair that fell across his forehead, in a way that suggested he had travelled far and fast through the winter storm. His coat was dusted with snow, and there was something about the set of his shoulders, the way he moved with absolute confidence despite arriving late and clearly unexpected, that commanded attention. But it was his face that held Elowen captive. It was a face carved from some harder substance than mere flesh, all sharp angles and severe beauty, with eyes so dark they appeared black in the candlelight. Those eyes swept across the ballroom with an expression that wasn't quite contempt, but wasn't far from it either, as if he were cataloguing every person present and finding them all wanting. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a name that seemed to carry its own weight, its own gravity. Ravenshire. The Duke of Ravenshire had returned. Valerian Thorn, who had left England under a cloud of rumours and speculation, who had vanished into the continent and stayed there while his estates fell into disrepair and his name became synonymous with scandal almost as notorious as Elowen's own. He had been gone so long that some had begun to wonder if he would ever return, if perhaps he had died in some foreign land pursuing whatever dark interests occupied men of his reputation. But here he stood, very much alive, brushing snow from his shoulders with a gesture that managed to be both careless and aristocratic. Lord Whitmore, their host, hurried forward to greet him, his expression a complicated mixture of surprise and calculation. The Duke of Ravenshire might carry scandal in his wake, but he was still a duke, still possessed of wealth and title and influence that could not be easily dismissed. Whitmore clasped his hand and spoke words Elowen couldn't hear from her distant corner, but she saw the Duke's response, the slight inclination of his head that conveyed courtesy without warmth, acknowledgement without enthusiasm. And then, inexplicably, impossibly, the Duke's gaze found hers across the expanse of the ballroom. It wasn't a casual glance, the kind that skimmed over her as so many others did. It was direct, penetrating and utterly focused, as if in that moment everyone else in the room had simply ceased to exist. Elowen felt her breath catch, felt heat rise to her cheeks, and she had to resist the urge to look away, to break that connection, because it felt too intense, too dangerous, too much like hope, and hope was something she had learned to live without. The Duke said something to Lord Whitmore, who looked startled and glanced in Elowen's direction with an expression of confusion. But Valerian Thorn was already moving, crossing the ballroom with long strides that scattered couples in his wake. The whispers rose to a crescendo. What was he doing? Why was he walking toward the corner where Miss Ashford sat alone as she always did? Surely he didn't know who she was, what she represented. Someone should warn him, someone should explain. But he moved too quickly for intervention, and besides, there was something in his bearing that suggested he would not welcome such interference. He stopped directly in front of her chair, and Elowen had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Up close he was even more striking, and she could see that his journey through the storm had left traces beyond the snow on his coat. There were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, and a tightness around his mouth that suggested pain held carefully in check. But when he spoke, his voice was steady, cultured, with a slight rasp that made it oddly intimate, despite the very public nature of this moment. "Miss Ashford, I presume." She managed to find her voice, though it emerged softer than she intended. "You have the advantage of me, sir. We have not been introduced." The corner of his mouth lifted in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Valerian Thorn, Duke of Ravenshire, and you're quite right, we have not been introduced, which makes what I'm about to do rather scandalous. But then, I understand we're both well acquainted with scandal, are we not?" Before she could formulate a response, he extended his hand, palm up, in the universal gesture of invitation. "Would you do me the honor of this dance, Miss Ashford?" The ballroom had gone utterly silent. Even the orchestra seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what she would do. Elowen stared at that outstretched hand as if it were some exotic creature she couldn't quite identify. When was the last time someone had asked her to dance? She couldn't even remember. The years had blurred together, each Christmas ball identical to the last, an endless procession of solitary evenings that she had convinced herself she had accepted, even made peace with. But she hadn't. She realized it in that moment, realized that beneath the careful composure she had constructed, beneath the resignation she wore like armor, there was still a part of her that yearned for this, for human connection, for the simple joy of moving to music with a partner, for the possibility that she might be seen as something other than a cautionary tale, a woman ruined by circumstances she had never controlled. She placed her hand in his, felt the warmth of his palm against hers, the calluses that spoke of a life more complicated than ballrooms and pleasantries. He helped her to her feet with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the severity of his features, and then he was leading her onto the dance floor, while every eye in the room tracked their progress with undisguised fascination. The musicians, perhaps sensing the significance of the moment, began a waltz, and Valerian Thorn placed one hand at her waist while maintaining his hold on her hand with the other. They began to move, and Elowen discovered that she had not forgotten how to dance, that her body remembered the patterns even if her heart had forgotten how to hope for such moments. He led with confidence, guiding her through the steps with an ease that suggested he had done this countless times before, yet there was nothing mechanical about it. He watched her face as they danced, not with the calculating assessment she sometimes saw in the eyes of those who bothered to look at her at all, but with something closer to curiosity. "You're wondering why," he said, after they had completed one circuit of the floor. It wasn't a question. "I am," she admitted, seeing no point in dissembling. "We don't know each other, Your Grace, and if you've heard anything at all about me, you know that I'm not someone whose company most people seek." "I've heard a great deal about you," he replied, spinning her gently, "but I've learned that what society says about a person and who they actually are rarely align. Besides, I was curious about the woman who has spent 16 Christmas Eves sitting alone in the corner of this ballroom, neither leaving nor complaining, neither begging for acceptance nor declaring war on those who have excluded her. That requires a particular kind of strength." Elowen felt something tighten in her throat. "You give me too much credit. It's not strength. It's simply the absence of alternatives." "I disagree." His hand tightened slightly at her waist, a gesture of emphasis rather than intimacy, though the line between the two felt dangerously thin. "You could have married some country gentleman and left society behind entirely. You could have retreated to your family's estate and lived out your days in comfortable obscurity. Instead, you return here, season after season, refusing to grant them the satisfaction of your complete defeat. That's not the absence of alternatives. That's defiance." She had never thought of it that way before. In her own mind, her continued attendance at these events had seemed more like stubbornness than strategy, a refusal to disappear that stemmed from pride rather than principle. But hearing him frame it differently made something shift inside her, made her see herself through new eyes, and she wasn't entirely certain she was comfortable with what she saw there. "And what of you, Your Grace?" she asked, deflecting attention from herself. "You've been gone for a long while. What brings you back to England, to this ballroom on this particular night?" His expression closed slightly, like shutters drawn across a window. "Unfinished business. Ghosts that need laying to rest. The usual reasons a man returns to the place he's been running from. And dancing with the social pariah? Does that serve some purpose in laying your ghosts to rest?" He was quiet for a moment, and they moved together through the other dancing couples, who maintained a careful distance as if scandal might be contagious, as if whatever stain marked both Elowen and the Duke might transfer through proximity. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped lower, meant only for her ears. "Perhaps I wanted to see if the ghosts everyone else sees when they look at you are the same ones I do. Perhaps I wanted to test a theory about the nature of reputation and whether it bears any relationship to truth. Or perhaps I simply saw a woman sitting alone and thought she deserved better than to spend another Christmas Eve as a spectator to other people's joy." The waltz ended, but he didn't immediately release her. They stood together in the center of the floor, while other couples dispersed around them, and Elowen was intensely aware of the weight of collective scrutiny pressing down on them from every corner of the ballroom. She should step back, should thank him politely for the dance and return to her chair, should not give the gossips any more fuel for their fires. But she found herself reluctant to break this connection, however temporary and inexplicable it might be. "They're talking about us," she said quietly. "They'll talk about nothing else for weeks." Let them talk. His thumb brushed almost imperceptibly across her knuckles, where he still held her hand. I stopped caring what they said about me a long time ago. I suspect you did too, or you wouldn't have survived 16 Christmases in this particular corner of hell. Despite herself, she smiled. It felt strange, that upward curve of her lips, as if she had forgotten the mechanics of pleasure and had to relearn them in real time. You have a rather dim view of high society, Your Grace. Experience has earned me that view, he replied. Then, still holding her hand, he led her off the dance floor, but instead of returning her to her corner, he guided her toward the tall windows overlooking the snow-covered gardens. Away from the immediate press of bodies, the air felt cooler, easier to breathe. She could see their reflection in the dark glass, two figures standing apart from the glittering crowd behind them, and for a moment it seemed to her that they belonged to a different world entirely, one that existed parallel to this one but operated by different rules. "Tell me about the scandal," he said, and it wasn't a request so much as an invitation. Not the version they tell at tea parties, the truth. Elowen hesitated. She had spent so many seasons refusing to defend herself, refusing to offer explanations or make excuses, that the idea of speaking about it now felt almost transgressive. But there was something about the directness of his question, the absence of prurient curiosity or judgmental condemnation, that made her want to answer honestly. "My mother died when I was 17, she began, her voice steady, despite the old pain the words evoked. She had been ill for some while, and her passing, though devastating, was not unexpected. What was unexpected was the discovery, shortly after her death, that she had been engaged in a long affair with Lord Hartwick, a married man whose wife was still very much alive, and whose influence in society was considerable. And society blamed you for your mother's choices," Valerian said, and there was an edge to his voice that suggested he was all too familiar with the machinery of collective judgment. Not directly, not at first. But Lord Hartwick's wife was vindictive in her grief and her rage. She began spreading rumors that I had known about the affair, that I had even facilitated it by carrying messages between the lovers, by providing cover for their meetings. None of it was true. I had been ignorant of my mother's liaison until the evidence of it emerged after her death. But Lady Hartwick was persuasive, and she had allies, and once the story took root, it grew until the truth became irrelevant. I became the girl who had helped her mother cuckold a peer of the realm. I became tainted by association, guilty by proximity. And your father, your family, did they not defend you? Elowen's laugh was bitter. My father had already passed by then. I had an uncle who might have intervened, but he was more concerned with protecting the family name than protecting me. He advised that I keep silent, that defending myself would only draw more attention to the scandal. He believed that if I simply endured, eventually society would lose interest and move on to the next source of entertainment. He was wrong. Or perhaps the problem was that I refused to disappear entirely, refused to make it easy for them to forget me. Valerian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the falling snow beyond the window. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was choosing his words with care. "I knew your mother. Not well, but we moved in some of the same circles before I left England. She was kind to me at a time when kindness was in short supply. I'm sorry for what happened to her, and I'm sorrier still for what you've endured in the aftermath." Elowen felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. She blinked them back, refusing to give in to emotion in such a public setting, but his words had pierced through defenses she had thought impregnable. No one had acknowledged her mother's kindness in relation to the scandal before. Everyone had been so focused on Caroline Ashford's transgression that her other qualities, her generosity and warmth, and the genuine care she had shown to others, had been erased, painted over with the broad brush of moral failure. "Thank you," she managed. "That means more than you might realize." Before he could respond, a voice interrupted them, sharp with poorly disguised hostility. "Ravenshire. I heard you had returned, though I confess I didn't quite believe it until I saw you with my own eyes." They both turned to find a man approaching, his expression set in lines of disapproval that seemed permanently etched into his features. Elowen recognized him as Lord Ashby, the same gentleman she had noted earlier for his excessive drinking and loud opinions. He was older than Valerian by perhaps a decade, with the beginning of a paunch straining against his waistcoat and a network of broken capillaries across his nose that spoke of too many nights spent with the bottle. "Ashby," Valerian acknowledged with a nod that managed to be both polite and dismissive. "I trust you've been well in my absence." "Well enough. No thanks to you and the mess you left behind when you fled like a coward." Ashby's words were slightly slurred, confirming Elowen's earlier assessment of his state. Convenient, wasn't it, disappearing to the continent just when questions were being asked about your brother's death, about your role in it? Elowen felt Valerian go very still beside her, a tension radiating from him that was palpable despite the fact that he hadn't moved. When he spoke, his voice was soft, which somehow made it more dangerous than if he had shouted. "My brother's death was investigated thoroughly by the magistrate and deemed an accident. If you have evidence to the contrary, I suggest you present it to the appropriate authorities rather than casting aspersions at a Christmas ball. Otherwise, I must assume you're simply drunk and speaking from malice rather than knowledge." Lord Ashby's face flushed an unpleasant shade of crimson. "Everyone knows what happened, even if it couldn't be proven. Your brother opposed your engagement to Miss Eleanor Pemberton, and suddenly he's found dead at the bottom of the cliffs near Ravenshire Hall. Remarkable timing, that." "Remarkable stupidity, what you're suggesting," Valerian replied, his tone still carefully controlled. "My brother was drunk, as he often was, and he went riding at night along a dangerous path. The tragedy was in the waste of a life, not in any imagined conspiracy. But I see you're determined to believe the worst of me, which I suppose makes you no different from the rest of society. At least you're honest about your prejudice." Ashby opened his mouth to respond, but Lord Whitmore appeared at his elbow, clearly having been alerted to the brewing confrontation. "Gentlemen, please. This is a celebration, not a courtroom. Perhaps we might all take a breath and remember the season of goodwill we're supposed to be honoring." "Of course," Valerian said smoothly. "My apologies for the disruption, Whitmore. I was just about to escort Miss Ashford to the refreshment table. If you'll excuse us, Ashby." He offered Elowen his arm, and she took it, grateful for the excuse to escape what had become an increasingly uncomfortable encounter. They moved away from both Lord Ashby and Lord Whitmore, weaving through the crowd toward the opposite end of the ballroom, where tables had been set up with champagne and delicacies. But Elowen's mind was churning, processing what she had just heard, the implications of Ashby's accusations. "Your brother," she said quietly, once they had achieved some distance from the others. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "There's no reason you should have," Valerian replied, accepting 2 glasses of champagne from a passing servant and handing one to her. "It happened shortly before I left England, and I imagine it was quickly supplanted by whatever other scandals captured society's fickle attention. But yes, my younger brother, Marcus, died in a riding accident. And yes, there were those who chose to believe I had some hand in it, because we had quarreled shortly before his death about my impending engagement." "Were you engaged to Eleanor Pemberton?" Elowen asked, then immediately regretted the question. "I'm sorry, that's terribly forward of me." "No more forward than my asking about your scandal," he pointed out. "And yes, I was engaged to her briefly. It was an arrangement that pleased our families more than it pleased either of us, and after Marcus died I realized I couldn't go through with it. I broke the engagement, which caused its own scandal, and then I left England because I couldn't breathe here anymore. The weight of everyone's suspicion, their judgment, their certainty that they knew the truth of what had happened, when they knew nothing at all. It was suffocating." "So you do understand," Elowen said, "what it's like to be condemned for something you didn't do." "I understand precisely," he agreed, "which is perhaps why I felt drawn to you across that ballroom. Recognition, maybe. 2 people marked by scandal, 2 people who have learned that society's forgiveness is far less readily granted than its condemnation." They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their champagne and watching the ongoing dance. Elowen was acutely aware that they were still the subject of intense scrutiny, that conversations were happening all around them in which their names undoubtedly featured prominently. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she found she didn't care. There was something liberating about standing beside someone who understood the particular weight of being judged, found wanting, and forced to carry that judgment like a physical burden. "The woman you were engaged to," Elowen ventured after a while. "Eleanor Pemberton. Is she Lady Pemberton's daughter?" "Her niece, actually. She married someone else after I broke our engagement, a baron from Scotland, and by all accounts she's quite happy, which only confirms that ending our engagement was the right choice for both of us." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "Though I don't imagine her aunt will be particularly pleased to see me dancing with you. Lady Pemberton has a long memory for slights, real or imagined." As if summoned by the mention of her name, Lady Pemberton appeared in Elowen's line of sight across the ballroom, her sharp features arranged in an expression of barely concealed displeasure. She was speaking with a cluster of other women, her hands moving expressively as she doubtless shared her opinions on the Duke's return and his inexplicable choice of companion for the evening. Elowen felt a familiar sinking sensation in her stomach, the instinctive dread of becoming the focus of that particular kind of female attention, the weaponized gossip that could destroy reputations more effectively than any direct attack. "Perhaps I should return to my corner," she said quietly. "I appreciate what you've done, Your Grace, more than you know, but I wouldn't want to cause you further trouble. Your return to society is already complicated enough without adding my particular baggage to your burden." Valerian set down his champagne glass with a decisive click against the table. "Miss Ashford, I didn't cross the Channel, ride through a snowstorm, and walk into this nest of vipers simply to retreat at the first sign of disapproval. If I wanted an easy evening, I would have stayed on the continent where people have the grace to mind their own business. I asked you to dance because I wanted to, and I'm standing here talking with you because I find your company considerably more interesting than anyone else's in this room. Unless you wish to be rid of me, in which case I'll accept that dismissal. But don't send me away out of some misguided attempt to protect me from consequences I'm fully prepared to accept." His vehemence surprised her, but it also sparked something in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the champagne. She met his eyes and saw determination there, along with something else, something that looked almost like defiance. He wasn't just being polite or performing some elaborate act of charity. He genuinely seemed to prefer her company to that of the other glittering personages filling the ballroom, and that realization was both thrilling and terrifying. "I don't wish to be rid of you," she said, and was surprised by how much she meant it. "But I would like to understand why. Why me? Why tonight? Why this particular gesture that you must have known would attract exactly this kind of attention?" He considered her question seriously, his gaze drifting to the windows where snow continued to fall in thick curtains, transforming the gardens into a landscape of white silence. When he looked back at her, there was something vulnerable in his expression, a crack in the armor he presented to the world. "I told you I came back to lay ghosts to rest," he said. "One of those ghosts is the man I was before I left, the person who cared too much about what others thought, who made choices based on family expectations and social pressure rather than his own convictions. I couldn't save my brother, I couldn't be honest about my own feelings, and I couldn't stand up to the collective judgment that blamed me for a death I had nothing to do with. I ran, and while I don't entirely regret leaving because I learned things about myself in those missing years, I do regret the manner of my departure, the cowardice of it." "So this is about redemption," Elowen said, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. "I'm a test case, a way for you to prove you've changed." "No," he said firmly. "You're not a test case or a project or some kind of redemptive exercise. You're a woman who has been treated abominably by people who should have known better. And I thought perhaps you might appreciate spending at least part of this evening with someone who doesn't judge you for crimes you didn't commit. If there's any selfishness in my motives, it's simply that I find I'm tired of pretending I care what they think." He gestured broadly at the assembled crowd. All of them, with their rigid rules and their hypocritical moral standards. "I spent too long trying to fit into a world that had no place for authenticity, for genuine feeling. I don't want to do that anymore." Elowen studied his face, searching for deception or hidden agenda, but found only what appeared to be sincerity. It was disconcerting, this directness, this refusal to hide behind polite fictions. She had grown so accustomed to double meanings and veiled insults that straightforward honesty felt almost foreign. "I don't know what to do with that," she admitted. "With you, this entire evening has been so far outside my normal experience that I feel unmoored." "Then perhaps we're perfectly matched," Valerian suggested. "Two people who have lived on the margins so long that the center feels strange and uncomfortable. We don't have to know what to do with this, we can simply let it be what it is." Before she could respond, the orchestra struck up another waltz, and without asking permission, he took her hand and led her back onto the dance floor. This time she went willingly, no longer caring about the whispers or the stares or Lady Pemberton's thin-lipped disapproval. They moved together with an ease that shouldn't have been possible given that they had only just met, but somehow the steps came naturally, their bodies finding a rhythm that transcended the technical requirements of the dance. They didn't speak as they waltzed, and Elowen found she didn't need words to feel connected to this man who had appeared so unexpectedly in her life. There was communication in the way he held her, in the slight pressure of his hand at her waist, guiding her through turns in the way his eyes never left her face. She felt seen in a way she hadn't for so long that she had almost forgotten what it was like to exist as a full person in someone else's regard, rather than as a shadow or a cautionary tale. The evening progressed, and against all expectation, Valerian Thorn did not leave her side. He procured her refreshments when she looked thirsty, engaged her in conversation that ranged from the trivial to the profound, and danced with her 3 more times, which was enough to constitute a declaration of serious interest by the rigid standards of their world. The ballroom hummed with speculation, with scandal renewed and multiplied, but Elowen found that she had crossed some invisible threshold beyond caring. It was during their 4th dance that he asked the question she had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "Miss Ashford, I realize this is precipitous given that we've known each other for all of a few hours, but I wonder if you might permit me to call on you after tonight. I leave tomorrow for Ravenshire Hall to address some estate matters that have been neglected during my absence, but I'll return to London before the season properly begins. I would very much like to continue our acquaintance if you're amenable." Elowen's heart beat faster, hope and fear warring in her chest. "Your Grace, you must know that being seen with me, showing me this kind of attention, will only damage your reputation further. Whatever hope you might have of restoring your standing in society will be compromised by an association with me." "Let me be absolutely clear about something," Valerian said, pulling her slightly closer so that their conversation could remain private despite the other dancers around them. "I have no interest in restoring my standing with people whose approval is contingent on my conformity to their narrow view of acceptable behavior. I'm a duke with independent wealth and properties that don't require society's blessing to maintain. I can live quite comfortably without their approval, and I intend to do exactly that. What I cannot do, having met you tonight, is simply walk away and pretend this evening didn't happen, that I didn't find in you something I haven't encountered in anyone else. Intelligence, resilience, the courage to endure what would have broken others. So I'm asking again, may I call on you?" She wanted to say yes. She wanted it with an intensity that frightened her, because wanting something this much meant it had the power to hurt her when it inevitably proved to be temporary or illusory. But she also couldn't deny herself this chance, couldn't turn away from the first real connection she had felt in 16 years of isolation. "Yes," she said, the word emerging as barely more than a whisper. "You may call on me." His smile transformed his face, softening the severe lines into something approaching boyish delight. "Thank you. You've made this return to England considerably less grim than I had anticipated." They finished the dance, and then Lord Whitmore was announcing that midnight had arrived, that Christmas had officially begun, and the entire assembly was invited to the chapel for a brief service of thanksgiving before the festivities concluded. The crowd began to move in that direction, a river of silk and wool flowing toward the small private chapel attached to the manor. Valerian kept Elowen's hand tucked into the crook of his arm as they joined the procession, and she was intensely aware of how this would appear to everyone observing them, how much speculation this would generate. The chapel was beautiful in its simplicity, lit by candles that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Everyone filed into the pews, and Elowen found herself sitting beside Valerian near the back. his solid presence a comfort in the midst of so many people who had shown her nothing but coldness over the years. The vicar spoke about light in darkness, about hope in the midst of winter, about new beginnings that Christmas represented, and Elowen felt every word resonate with painful relevance to her situation. When the service ended, and people began to depart, heading for their carriages and the warmth of their homes, Valerian walked Elowen to where her own carriage waited. Snow had accumulated during the evening, blanketing the world in white, and their breath misted in the cold air. He handed her into the carriage himself, then leaned in the doorway, heedless of the snow gathering on his shoulders. "I'll write to you from Ravenshire," he said, "and I'll return as soon as I'm able. In the meantime, please know that tonight meant something to me. You mean something to me, though I can't fully articulate why yet. I'm not typically given to romantic declarations or impulsive emotions, but there's something about you that has disrupted my careful control." Elowen felt tears threaten again and blinked them back. "Tonight meant something to me as well, more than I think I can adequately express. Thank you, Your Grace, for seeing me, for treating me as if I were worthy of your time and attention." "You are worthy," he said with such conviction that she almost believed him. "Don't let them convince you otherwise. The same people who judge you so harshly are the ones who wouldn't survive a day bearing the scrutiny they so freely dispense to others." He stepped back and the driver closed the carriage door. As they pulled away from Whitmore Manor, Elowen looked back through the window to see Valerian standing in the snow, watching her departure, and she felt something shift in her chest, some locked door beginning to open after 16 years of being sealed shut. The journey home passed in a blur of contradictory emotions. Joy at what had happened, fear that it couldn't possibly last, hope that perhaps her long exile from human connection might be ending, terror that this might all be some elaborate illusion that would shatter in the cold light of day. By the time she reached her townhouse in London, she was exhausted but too agitated to sleep. She dismissed her maid, promising she could manage on her own, and stood in her bedroom still wearing her ball gown, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Who was this woman looking back at her? She had the same face, the same dark hair and grey eyes that had always defined her appearance, but there was something different in her expression, some subtle alteration that spoke of possibility rather than resignation. She touched her waist where Valerian's hand had rested during their dances, trying to recapture the feeling of being held, being wanted, being seen. Sleep eventually claimed her, and she dreamed of snow and candlelight and dark eyes that saw past scandal to the person beneath. She woke late on Christmas morning to find a package had been delivered. Inside was a book, a collection of poetry she had mentioned enjoying in one of their conversations the previous evening, along with a note in strong, slashing handwriting. "Something to occupy you while I'm trapped at Ravenshire, dealing with tenants and accounts. Think of me occasionally, as I will certainly be thinking of you, V." She pressed the note to her chest and allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that this might be real, that her years of isolation might truly be ending, that the Duke of Ravenshire might actually be everything he seemed to be. The days following Christmas passed in a strange, suspended state. Elowen waited for the inevitable backlash, for the social consequences of her evening with Valerian to materialize in the form of withdrawn invitations or cutting remarks from the few people who still acknowledged her existence. But nothing happened. Or rather, something did happen, but not what she had expected. Instead of being further ostracized, she found herself the subject of intense curiosity. Ladies who had previously looked through her as if she were invisible now sought opportunities to ask pointed questions about the Duke of Ravenshire, about his intentions, about the nature of their acquaintance. She handled these inquiries with the same careful courtesy she had cultivated over the years, revealing nothing while remaining polite, giving them no ammunition to use against her. But internally, she was deeply unsettled by this attention. She had become accustomed to invisibility, had learned to navigate the world as a ghost moving through spaces without disturbing them. This sudden visibility felt dangerous, exposing her to judgments she had learned to avoid by remaining beneath notice. A letter arrived from Valerian 3 days after Christmas. He wrote about Ravenshire Hall, which he described as having fallen into considerable disrepair during his absence, about the tenants who greeted his return with a mixture of relief and suspicion, about the weight of responsibilities he had neglected for too long. But he also wrote about her, about how thoughts of their evening together sustained him through tedious meetings with his steward and uncomfortable conversations with neighbors who clearly believed the worst about him. She read his letter multiple times, analyzing each phrase for hidden meanings or signs that his interest was waning, but found only warmth and genuine affection. She wrote back carefully, conscious that her words might be read by others if the letter went astray, but trying to convey something of what his attention meant to her, how it had altered her perception of her own life and possibilities. They continued this correspondence throughout the cold weeks of January, letters travelling back and forth between London and Ravenshire, with increasing frequency. Valerian's letters grew progressively more personal, more revealing of the man beneath the title and the scandal. He wrote about his brother Marcus with a grief that was still raw despite the passing of time, about the guilt he carried for not recognizing how deep his brother's drinking problem had become, for not being there the night Marcus had ridden off into darkness and never returned. He wrote about his broken engagement with Eleanor Pemberton, admitting that he had agreed to it because it was expected, because he had been raised to understand that dukes married for advantage rather than affection, but that Marcus's death had shattered his willingness to live according to other people's scripts. In return, Elowen found herself opening up in ways she hadn't with anyone since her mother's death. She wrote about the loneliness of being constantly among people yet perpetually alone, about the small rebellions that sustained her, like continuing to attend events where she knew she would be ignored, like wearing her grandmother's emerald bracelet as a quiet assertion of her own worth. She wrote about her mother, not the scandalous figure society remembered, but the woman who had read her poetry before bed and taught her that kindness was never wasted, even when it wasn't reciprocated. Their correspondence created an intimacy that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Elowen knew she was falling for him, or at least for the version of him that existed in these letters, and she tried to maintain some emotional distance, some protective barrier against the inevitable disappointment. But with each letter, that barrier eroded a little more, until she had to admit that she was well and truly invested in whatever this was becoming between them. It was mid-February when she received a letter that was different from the others, shorter, more urgent in tone. Valerian wrote that he had uncovered something while going through his brother's effects, something that suggested Marcus's death might not have been the simple accident everyone had believed. He didn't provide details, wrote only that he needed to investigate further before making any accusations, but that if he was right, it would mean someone had deliberately engineered his brother's death and allowed Valerian to bear the blame for it. Elowen's hands shook as she read the letter. The implications were staggering. If Valerian could prove that Marcus had been murdered, it would not only clear his own name, but expose whoever was actually responsible. But it would also make him dangerous to the real killer, would paint a target on his back that could prove fatal. She wanted to write back immediately, to warn him to be careful, to not pursue this alone. But before she could reach for her writing desk, there was a knock at her door. Her butler entered with an apologetic expression. "Miss Ashford, Lord Ashby is here to see you. He was most insistent, and I wasn't certain you would want me to turn away a peer, even though he arrived without appointment or invitation." Elowen felt ice slide down her spine. Lord Ashby, who had confronted Valerian at the Christmas ball, who had been among the loudest voices proclaiming the Duke's guilt in his brother's death. What could he possibly want with her? "Show him to the drawing room," she said, rising to smooth her dress. "And remain within earshot, please. I may need you to show Lord Ashby out if he proves difficult." The butler nodded and withdrew. Elowen took a moment to compose herself, to push down the anxiety that was making her heart race, then proceeded to the drawing room with her head high and her expression carefully neutral. Lord Ashby stood near the fireplace, his bulk dominating the space in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. He turned when she entered, and his expression was a complicated mixture of contempt and calculation. "Miss Ashford, thank you for receiving me. I apologize for the informality of this visit, but the matter I need to discuss couldn't wait for proper channels." "What matter would that be, Lord Ashby?" she asked, remaining standing rather than inviting him to sit. She wanted to keep this encounter as brief as possible. "It's about the Duke of Ravenshire. I understand you've been corresponding with him since his return to England." I'm here to warn you, for your own good, that continuing any association with that man is extremely unwise. I appreciate your concern, Elowin said carefully, but I'm not certain what business my correspondence is of yours. His expression hardened. It becomes my business when the man in question is dangerous, and you're too naive to recognize it. Ravenshire killed his brother, Miss Ashford. The magistrate may have ruled it an accident due to insufficient evidence, but those of us who knew Marcus understand exactly what happened. He and Valerian quarreled about the engagement to Miss Pemberton. Marcus opposed it, knew it was wrong, and Valerian couldn't tolerate that opposition. So he arranged an accident. Convenient, wasn't it, that Marcus just happened to ride drunk along those cliffs on that particular night? That's a serious accusation, Elowin said. And from what I understand, one without any evidence to support it. Evidence can be difficult to obtain when the person you're investigating is a duke with money and influence, Ashby countered. But I knew Marcus well. He was a friend, and I owe it to his memory to ensure that his killer doesn't harm anyone else. Which brings me to you. You've caught Ravenshire's attention, which puts you in danger. He's ruthless, Miss Ashford. He eliminates obstacles. His brother was an obstacle, and now he's dead. I would hate to see you meet a similar fate simply because you were foolish enough to believe his lies. There was something off about his delivery, something that rang false despite the apparent earnestness of his concern. Elowin studied him carefully, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. When she finally spoke, it was with deliberate precision. Lord Ashby, I appreciate that you cared for Marcus Thorne, and that his death affected you deeply. But I cannot help noticing that your concern for my welfare seems to coincide rather conveniently with the Duke's return to England and his beginning to ask questions about what actually happened to his brother. One might almost think you have reasons beyond friendship for wanting to keep him isolated, for wanting to ensure that anyone who might support him or stand with him is sufficiently frightened away. Ashby's face flushed dark red. You're treading on dangerous ground, Miss Ashford. Making accusations you can't prove. I'm not making accusations, she replied calmly. I'm merely observing that your timing is interesting, and I'm declining your advice, such as it is. I will continue my correspondence with the Duke of Ravenshire, and I will make my own judgments about his character based on my interactions with him, rather than on speculation and rumor. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other matters requiring my attention. She moved toward the door, a clear dismissal, but Ashby caught her arm as she passed, his grip tight enough to hurt. You're making a mistake. And when Ravenshire shows his true colors, don't expect sympathy from anyone. You've already spent 16 years as a social pariah. Is it really worth risking your life for a man you barely know? Elowin looked pointedly at his hand on her arm until he released her. Thank you for your visit, Lord Ashby. My butler will show you out. She pulled the bell cord, and her butler appeared so quickly that she suspected he had indeed been listening from nearby. He escorted Lord Ashby out, while Elowin remained in the drawing room, her composure intact until she heard the front door close. Only then did she allow herself to sink into a chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. Ashby's visit had confirmed something she had begun to suspect from Valerian's last letter. Whatever had happened to Marcus Thorne, it wasn't a simple accident. And there were people who were very invested in maintaining the fiction that it had been. The question was why? What did Ashby or anyone else stand to gain from Marcus's death and Valerian's exile? She needed to write to Valerian immediately, needed to warn him that people were actively working against him, trying to isolate him and drive away anyone who might support him. But even as she reached for paper and pen, she hesitated. If letters could travel from London to Ravenshire, they could also be intercepted. If someone was truly trying to keep Valerian from discovering the truth about his brother's death, they might well be monitoring his correspondence. The sound of the door knocker interrupted her thoughts, and moments later, her butler appeared again, this time holding a calling card that made her heart leap. The Duchess of Thornfield requesting a visit. Elowin knew the Duchess slightly, had exchanged pleasantries with her at various events, but they had never been intimate. What could bring her here? Show her in, please, Elowin said, rising to receive her unexpected guest. The Duchess of Thornfield swept into the room with the kind of presence that came from a lifetime of authority and privilege. She was perhaps 50, with silver threading through her dark hair and keen eyes that missed nothing. She accepted Elowen's invitation to sit, arranged her skirts with practiced efficiency, and then fixed Elowen with a direct look. "Miss Ashford, I'll come straight to the point because I respect your intelligence too much to dance around the issue. I've been watching what's been happening with you and the Duke of Ravenshire, and I wanted to offer you some information that I believe you need to hear." "Information about what, Your Grace?" "About Marcus Thorne's death and about the people who had reasons to want both him dead and his brother exiled." The Duchess paused, then continued. "I was a friend of Valerian's mother, rest her soul. I knew both her sons well. Marcus was troubled, certainly, but he wasn't the careless drunk everyone believed him to be. And the night he died, he wasn't drunk at all. I know because I saw him earlier that evening at a small dinner party. He was completely sober, and he was agitated about something. He told me he had discovered something about Lord Ashby that was dangerous, something that could ruin him." Elowen's breath caught. What did he discover? He didn't share the details, said only that he needed to speak with his brother before taking any action, but he never got that chance because he died that very night. And in the aftermath, with everyone focused on the brothers' quarrel about the engagement, no one thought to question what Marcus might have been investigating, or whether his death might be connected to it. "You think Lord Ashby killed him?" Elowen said. It wasn't a question. "I think Marcus Thorne discovered something that made him dangerous, and I think Lord Ashby had both the motive and the opportunity to silence him, but I have no proof, nothing that would hold up to scrutiny, which is why I'm telling you this now. Ravenshire is asking questions, and that makes him a target. If he's involved you in his investigation, either through correspondence or shared confidences, then you're a target as well. Lord Ashby visited you today, didn't he?" "How did you know?" The Duchess smiled thinly. "I have people who keep me informed about matters of interest. Ashby came here to try to frighten you away from Ravenshire, to isolate the Duke and make him vulnerable. Don't let him succeed. Valerian needs allies, people who believe him and will stand with him while he uncovers the truth. From what I've observed, you have both the strength and the integrity to be that person." Elowen felt tears threaten, not from fear but from the overwhelming relief of being believed, of having someone acknowledge that she might have value beyond being a cautionary tale. "What should I do? How can I help him?" "First, be very careful about written correspondence. Assume your letters are being read by people who wish you both ill. If you need to communicate something sensitive, do it through my household. My servants are absolutely loyal and discreet. Second, prepare yourself for what's coming. If Valerian proves that Marcus was murdered and that Ashby was responsible, there will be a reckoning that will shake society to its foundations. It won't be easy or pleasant, and you'll be at the center of it alongside him. Are you prepared for that?" "I've spent 16 years at the center of scandal," Elowen said. "One more won't break me. And if there's a chance to clear both Valerian's name and my own understanding of the truth, then yes, I'm prepared to face whatever comes." The Duchess studied her for a long moment, then nodded with apparent satisfaction. "Good. I thought you had steel in your spine, but it's pleasant to have it confirmed. Now I'm going to leave you my private address. If you need to reach Ravenshire urgently, send a message to my house, and I'll ensure it gets to him without interception. And if Ashby or anyone else threatens you, contact me immediately. I may be old, but I still have considerable influence, and I'm not afraid to use it." She rose, and Elowen rose with her. At the door, the Duchess paused and placed a hand briefly on Elowen's arm. "Your mother was a good woman who made choices that society judged harshly, but she was kind to me when I was going through my own difficulties, and I've never forgotten it. Consider this my way of repaying that kindness to her daughter." After the Duchess left, Elowen sat down and wrote a careful letter to Valerian, one that would appear innocuous if intercepted, but which she hoped would convey her warning. She wrote about the weather, about books she was reading, but woven through the mundane details were phrases they had used in earlier letters, references that would alert him to the fact that she knew he was in danger and that she was standing with him regardless of the cost. She sent the letter through normal channels, then wrote a second, much more explicit message detailing Lord Ashby's visit and the Duchess's warning. This one she sent to the Duchess of Thornfield's address, with instructions to forward it to Ravenshire through secure means. The response came faster than she had dared hope. Within 3 days, Valerian himself appeared at her door, travel-worn and clearly having ridden hard through winter conditions to reach London. Her butler showed him into the drawing room, and the moment they were alone, he crossed the space between them and took her hands in his. "I came as soon as I received your message through the Duchess," he said. "Are you all right? Did Ashby threaten you?" "I'm fine," she assured him, though her heart was racing at his proximity, at the concern evident in his face. "He tried to frighten me away from you, but he failed. Your Grace, the Duchess of Thornfield told me things about Marcus, about what he discovered before he died. You need to be careful. If Lord Ashby is responsible for your brother's death, he won't hesitate to harm you too if you get too close to the truth." "I know," Valerian said grimly. "I've been gathering evidence, speaking with people who were there that night. Marcus wasn't drunk when he died, Elowen. Multiple witnesses have confirmed that now, and I've discovered what he found out about Ashby. The man has been embezzling from his own estates, selling off entailed property that should have passed to his heir, pocketing the money to fund his gambling debts. Marcus somehow learned about it and was going to expose him. So Ashby arranged the accident, made sure Marcus was riding that night along those cliffs, made sure there would be witnesses to attest to his drinking despite the fact that he was sober." "Can you prove it?" Elowen asked. "I'm close. I have the financial records that show the embezzlement. What I need is evidence connecting Ashby directly to Marcus's death. The cliff path that night was sabotaged. Someone had loosened stones and created a trap that would send any horse stumbling over the edge. Finding proof that Ashby was responsible for that will be more difficult. But I have leads." "Then you need to pursue them," Elowen said, "but carefully. And you shouldn't do this alone." "I'm not alone," he said, squeezing her hands gently. "I have you and the Duchess, and others who have begun to reach out now that they know I'm looking for the truth. But Elowen, I need you to understand what you're risking by standing with me. If I succeed in proving Ashby's guilt, there will be a scandal that will make what we've both endured look minor by comparison. And you'll be at the center of it as the woman who supported me. Your reputation, such as it is, will be further damaged." "My reputation has been damaged for 16 years, she replied. "I'm not afraid of more scandal, especially not if it means justice for your brother and vindication for you. But I need to know something, Your Grace. Is this about justice, or is it about revenge? Because those are two different things, and the answer matters." He was silent for a moment, his dark eyes searching her face. When he spoke, his voice was low and serious. "It started as revenge. I wanted to destroy the people who had destroyed my brother and driven me into exile. But it's become about more than that. It's about truth, about refusing to let lies stand unchallenged, about ensuring that Marcus's death has meaning beyond the tragedy of it. And it's become about us, about creating a world where we can exist without the weight of false accusations and undeserved shame. So yes, I want justice, but I also want a future where I can ask you to be part of my life without worrying that I'm condemning you to more years of isolation and judgment." Elowen felt something crack open in her chest, some last defensive wall crumbling under the weight of his honesty. "Then we'll pursue justice together. But Valerian, you need to know that I don't need vindication to choose you. Even if society never changes its mind about either of us, even if we spend the rest of our lives as outcasts, I would still choose this, choose you. Because for the first time in 16 years, I feel like I'm alive, rather than just existing." He lifted one hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing gently across her cheekbone. "I don't deserve you. I don't deserve your faith or your courage or your willingness to stand with me against everything. But I'm selfish enough to accept it anyway, because the alternative is losing you, and I find I can't tolerate that thought." He kissed her then, gentle and careful, as if she were something precious that might break under too much passion. But Elowen had spent 16 years being treated as if she were fragile or damaged, and she was done with being handled carefully. She wound her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the loneliness and longing she had suppressed for so long, and he responded with a hunger that matched her own, pulling her closer until there was no space between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "Not now. Not until this is resolved, and I can offer you something better than my scandalous name. But when it's done, when the truth is out and Marcus has justice, marry me. Be my Duchess. Help me rebuild Ravenshire into something worth having. Choose a future with me, instead of a past defined by other people's judgments." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes to all of it. But Valerian, I would marry you tomorrow if you asked. I don't need to wait for vindication or cleared names. I just need you." He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise rather than a confession. "Then consider yourself engaged to a scandalous duke who is about to make himself considerably more scandalous by exposing a murderer. I hope you know what you're getting yourself into." "I know exactly what I'm getting myself into," she assured him, "and I've never been more certain of anything." They spent the rest of that afternoon making plans, discussing strategy for how to pursue the investigation without alerting Ashby to how close they were getting to the truth. Valerian would return to Ravenshire to continue gathering evidence, while Elowyn would remain in London to monitor Ashby's activities and serve as a contact point for the Duchess and other allies who were beginning to emerge. It wasn't safe for them to be seen together too often or too openly. Not yet. Not until they had enough proof to make their accusations stick. When he finally had to leave, darkness had fallen and snow was beginning to drift down again. He held her at the door, reluctant to release her. "Be careful. Ashby is dangerous and now he knows you won't be frightened away. Don't take unnecessary risks." "The same applies to you," she said. "Come back to me. That's all I ask. Come back whole and safe." "I will," he promised. "I have far too much to live for now to do anything foolish." He kissed her once more, then disappeared into the snowy night, and Elowyn stood at her window watching until she could no longer see his figure moving through the darkness. She touched her lips where he had kissed her and felt the unfamiliar sensation of happiness blooming in her chest. It was fragile, this new joy, vulnerable to all the dangers that lay ahead. But it was also real, more real than anything she had experienced in the long years of her exile from human connection. The next weeks were tense and difficult. Valerian sent regular updates through the Duchess's secure channels, detailing the evidence he was accumulating, the witnesses he was locating, the web of deceit he was slowly untangling. Lord Ashby began making mistakes, his behavior growing increasingly erratic as he sensed the investigation closing in around him. He drank more heavily, spoke more carelessly, and on one memorable occasion publicly threatened Valerian at a gentleman's club, only to have his words reported back through multiple sources. Elowyn found herself sought after in social situations for the first time in years, not because people had suddenly decided she was acceptable, but because they wanted information about the Duke of Ravenshire and his investigation. She handled these inquiries with careful diplomacy, revealing nothing while maintaining the appearance of openness. She became quite skilled at deflection, at redirecting conversations away from dangerous territory while still seeming cooperative. It was the Duchess of Thornfield who finally provided the crucial piece of evidence they needed. She had kept Marcus Thorne's effects after his death, including his personal journal, which she had thought to review in light of recent events. The journal contained detailed notes about Ashby's financial crimes, along with Marcus's plans to confront him and demand restitution. More importantly, it contained an entry from the day he died, noting that he had arranged to meet Ashby at the cliff path to give him one final chance to confess before taking his evidence to the authorities. It was as close to proof of premeditation as they were likely to get. Marcus had gone to that meeting alone, trusting that Ashby would do the right thing, and Ashby had repaid that trust with murder. Valerian brought his evidence to the magistrate, and a formal investigation was opened. Lord Ashby was arrested and charged with murder and embezzlement. The scandal that erupted made Elowyn's mother's affair seem tame by comparison. A peer of the realm accused of killing another peer's son and then allowing the dead man's brother to be blamed for the crime. Society reeled. The trial, when it came, was sensational. Witnesses testified to Marcus Thorne's sobriety the night he died. Financial experts detailed the embezzlement. A stable hand came forward to admit that Ashby had paid him to tamper with the cliff path, though he claimed he hadn't known anyone would die as a result. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, and ultimately conclusive. Lord Ashby was found guilty and sentenced to hang. But before the sentence could be carried out, he died in his cell, apparently from poison self-administered rather than face the public humiliation of execution. Even in death, he managed to rob them of full justice. But the vindication was real nonetheless. Valerian's name was cleared completely, the cloud of suspicion that had followed him lifted by the weight of evidence and truth. And in the process, people began to reconsider other old scandals, other old judgments. If they had been so wrong about the Duke of Ravenshire, what else might they have been wrong about? Elowen found that her own social rehabilitation happened quietly, almost imperceptibly. Invitations began to arrive, not many at first, but enough to signal a shift. Ladies who had spent years looking through her now stopped to chat. Gentlemen who had avoided her gaze now bowed when they passed. It wasn't a complete transformation, and there were still those who maintained their disapproval, but the wall that had separated her from society for 16 years began to develop cracks. She didn't particularly care about the social rehabilitation for its own sake. What mattered was that the truth had won, that lies had been exposed, that justice, delayed and incomplete though it was, had been served. Valerian proposed officially in the spring, on the anniversary of the Christmas ball where they had met. He arranged for them to return to Whitmore Manor, the same ballroom where she had spent 16 years in isolation, where he had first crossed the floor to ask her to dance. The room was empty now, no crowds or music or judgment, just the two of them standing in the space where their story had begun. "I wanted to reclaim this place," he told her, as they stood together where they had first danced. "To take something that represented loneliness and isolation for both of us and transform it into a symbol of what we've found together. This is where I first saw you, where I first understood that there were other people in the world who carried the same weight I did, who had survived what should have broken them. And this is where I want to ask you, formally and completely, to be my wife." He went down on one knee, produced a ring that had belonged to his mother, a simple band of gold set with emeralds that matched the bracelet she wore. "Elowen Ashford, will you marry me? Will you be my Duchess and my partner, and my reminder that truth matters more than reputation, that courage outlasts scandal, that love can grow in the most unlikely places?" "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet so she could kiss him properly. "Yes to everything. Today, tomorrow, always." They were married 6 weeks later, in a small ceremony at Ravenshire Hall, with only a handful of close friends and family in attendance. The Duchess of Thornfield stood as Elowen's sponsor, and as she prepared to walk down the aisle, the older woman took her hand and squeezed gently. "Your mother would be so proud of you," she said, "of your strength and your integrity and your refusal to be defined by other people's failures. You've honored her memory better than any vindication could have." Elowen felt tears sting her eyes but blinked them back. There would be time for tears later, tears of joy rather than sorrow. For now, she simply wanted to move forward into her future, into a life defined by her own choices rather than others' judgments. Valerian was waiting for her at the altar, and the expression on his face when he saw her made everything they had endured worth it. Love and wonder and gratitude all mixed together in a look that told her more clearly than words that she was cherished, valued, seen for exactly who she was. They spoke their vows in steady voices, made their promises to each other with the weight of hard-won wisdom behind them. They knew what it was to be tested, to be judged, to be found wanting by a world that rarely looked beneath surfaces. And they chose each other anyway, chose hope over cynicism, love over safety, truth over comfortable lies. When the vicar pronounced them married and Valerian kissed her, Elowen felt the last pieces of her old life fall away, the woman who had sat alone for 16 Christmases, finally allowed to rest. She was the Duchess of Ravenshire now, partner to a man who had crossed a ballroom to claim her when no one else would, who had seen past scandal to the person beneath. They hosted a ball at Ravenshire Hall the following Christmas, the first such event since before Valerian had left England. The invitation list was carefully curated, including all those who had supported them during the difficult months of the investigation, along with a few carefully chosen others who represented the possibility of reconciliation with the broader social world. Helison stood beside her husband at the entrance to the ballroom. greeting guests with the same grace she had once used to endure being ignored, but now it was powered by joy rather than resignation. She wore her grandmother's emerald bracelet and a matching necklace that Valerian had commissioned, symbols of continuity and new beginnings woven together. As the music started and couples began to dance, Valerian took her hand. "May I have this dance, Your Grace?" "Always," she said, letting him lead her onto the floor. They moved together with the ease of long practice now, their steps perfectly synchronized, and Elowen marveled at how much had changed in 1 year, how far she had traveled from that lonely corner at Whitmore Manor to this place of belonging and joy, how the man who had seemed like an impossibility had become her husband, her partner, her home. "What are you thinking?" Valerian asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear over the music. "I'm thinking about ghosts," she said, "about the ones we've laid to rest and the ones that might still linger. I'm thinking about Marcus and hoping he knows that his death meant something, that it led to justice and truth and all the things he valued. I'm thinking about my mother and hoping she would approve of the choices I've made, the life I've built. But mostly I'm thinking about how grateful I am for that Christmas Eve when you walked into a ballroom and saw me when no one else had for 16 years. "I'm the one who should be grateful," he replied. "You gave me a reason to come home, a reason to fight for the truth, a reason to believe that redemption was possible. You gave me everything, Elowen." "Then we gave each other everything," she said, "and that's more than enough." They danced until the evening faded into night, until the guests began to depart and the candles burned low, until they were alone in the ballroom, with only the echoes of music and laughter remaining. And standing there in the place, they had transformed from the site of their exile into the center of their shared life. They held each other and understood that some stories end not with perfect resolution, but with the promise of continued growth, continued love, continued grace. The Christmas balls would continue, season after season, but neither of them would ever again sit alone on the margins, watching life happen to other people. They had claimed their place, together, and nothing society could say or do would take that from them again. Epilogue. 3 winters passed, each one softening the sharp edges of their story, until it became something gentler, something that belonged to them rather than to the gossips who had once wielded it like a weapon. Ravenshire Hall flourished under their joint stewardship. The gardens that had gone wild during Valerian's absence now restored to their former glory, the tenants prospering under fair management and genuine care. Elowen discovered that she had a gift for the practical aspects of running an estate, for listening to people's concerns, and finding solutions that benefited everyone involved. The woman who had spent so many years invisible in ballrooms became vitally visible in the lives of those who depended on Ravenshire, and she found a purpose in that visibility that society events had never provided. On a cold December afternoon in their 3rd year of marriage, Elowen stood in the nursery they had prepared months earlier, holding their newborn daughter against her chest and marveling at the tiny perfection of her. Caroline Ashford Thorne, named for the grandmother she would never meet but whose kindness lived on through her mother's memories. The baby made small sounds of contentment, and Elowen felt tears slide down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that she had been given a chance to create a different kind of legacy, one built on love rather than scandal, on truth rather than rumor. Valerian entered the nursery quietly, still wearing his riding clothes, snow dusting his shoulders from his morning inspection of the estate. His expression softened immediately upon seeing his wife and daughter together, and he crossed to them with the careful reverence of someone approaching something sacred. He placed a gentle kiss on Elowen's temple, then looked down at their sleeping child with wonder still fresh in his eyes, despite 3 days of fatherhood. "She's perfect," he whispered, as if speaking louder might disturb the peace that had settled over the room like a blessing. "She is," Elowen agreed, "and she'll grow up knowing she's loved, knowing she's wanted, knowing that her parents chose each other against all odds and built something real from the ruins of what others tried to destroy." Valerian wrapped his arms around both of them, creating a circle of warmth and protection. "She'll never know what it is to sit alone in a corner, watching life happen to other people. We'll make sure of that. She'll be raised to stand up for truth, to judge people by their character rather than rumor, to have the courage her mother showed in surviving 16 years of unjust exile. The Duchess of Thornfield visited the following week, making the journey from London despite the winter weather, because she insisted that great goddaughters required proper inspection and approval. She arrived laden with gifts, including a christening gown that had been in her family for generations, and a letter she had kept safe all these years, written by Caroline Ashford to her shortly before her death. Elawen read it with trembling hands, her mother's familiar script bringing both pain and comfort. The letter spoke of hope for her daughter's future, of faith that Elawen would find her way through whatever difficulties lay ahead, of love that would transcend death and scandal and time itself. She knew, Elawen said softly, looking up at the Duchess through tears. Somehow she knew that it would be difficult, but that I would survive it. Your mother understood that real strength isn't about avoiding hardship, the Duchess replied. It's about enduring it with grace and emerging with your integrity intact. You've honored everything she hoped for you, my dear, and now you're passing that strength on to another generation. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow and clear skies, and Ravensshire Hall hosted its annual ball, now firmly established as one of the social season's most anticipated events. But this year held special significance because it marked exactly 4 years since Valerian had walked into Whitmore Manor's ballroom and crossed that vast expanse of polished floor to ask a lonely woman to dance. They had made it a tradition to recreate that first dance each Christmas Eve, a private moment before the festivities began in earnest, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had travelled together. Elawen wore green silk that matched her grandmother's emerald bracelet, and Valerian looked distinguished in formal black, though his eyes held the same intensity they had possessed that first night, when he had looked across a crowded room and seen her in a way no one else had for 16 years. They stood together in the ballroom before the guests arrived, the space decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, candles casting the same golden glow that had illuminated so many years of loneliness before transforming into the light of joy. Do you ever think about who you would be if that Christmas Eve had never happened? Elawen asked as they began to dance, moving through familiar patterns that now felt like coming home. I think about it sometimes, Valerian admitted. I think I would have remained angry and bitter, focused on the injustice of what had been done to me and Marcus, rather than on building something new. I think I would have let the past consume me, instead of using it to forge a better future. You saved me from that, Elawen. You showed me that survival could be its own form of triumph, that refusing to be broken by circumstances could be the most powerful kind of resistance. We saved each other, she corrected gently. I was drowning in isolation, convincing myself that I had accepted it, when really I was just too afraid to hope for anything different. You gave me permission to want more, to believe I deserved more, to fight for a life defined by my choices rather than others' judgments. The first guests began to arrive, and they separated to fulfill their roles as host and hostess, greeting old friends and new acquaintances with genuine warmth. Eleanor Pemberton, now Lady Ashford, arrived with her husband and children, and there was no awkwardness in their interaction, only mutual respect and the understanding that sometimes broken engagements were blessings in disguise. Lady Pemberton herself attended, her previous disapproval softened by time and the undeniable evidence that her niece's former fiancé had found genuine happiness with a woman everyone had underestimated. As midnight approached and the vicar prepared to lead them in prayer to welcome Christmas, Elawen looked around the ballroom, filled with people laughing and dancing and celebrating together, and she thought about that other woman, the one who had sat alone for 16 consecutive Christmases, enduring in silence. That woman still existed within her, her experiences and pain and hard-won wisdom woven into the fabric of who Elawen had become. But she was no longer defined by that loneliness, no longer trapped in that corner watching life happen elsewhere. She had claimed her place in the light, had built a family and a home and a future worth having, and she had done it not by forgetting the darkness, but by refusing to let it have the final word. Valerian found her hand and squeezed it gently, and when she looked up at him, she saw reflected in his eyes everything they had survived and everything they had built, and everything they still had yet to discover together. The church bells began to ring, announcing Christmas, and the entire assembly joined in singing, their voices rising together in celebration of light overcoming darkness, of hope triumphing over despair, of love proving stronger than scandal or judgment or time itself. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining us on Eloan and Valerian's incredible journey from isolation to love, from scandal to redemption. If this story touched your heart the way we hoped it would, we would be absolutely thrilled if you could take just a moment to subscribe to our channel, leave us a comment sharing your thoughts about this Christmas tale, and hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it. And please don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss another story of hope, love, and second chances. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more unforgettable stories with you. Until next time, may your own life be filled with unexpected joys and the courage to claim the happiness you deserve.